Why worry? So, but there's some interesting things there that I do want to touch on because I think, um, you know, and I also would say I don't think that there's anything special about the United States in terms of its global hunt for petro and hydrocarbon. China is essentially neo-colonizing many parts of Africa. Russia will, in the short term, with the Arctic drilling, benefit from global warming. And obviously, the United States still has a foreign policy built on securing hydrocarbons. There's nothing specific about the U.S. in that equation other than regional influences and scale of power. But let's touch on that for a second. There's a good piece Joe Rahm wrote up in Think Progress. Sorry, media, Exxon CEO is Trump's worst possible nominee for climate and America. And there's a couple of sort of points that he's laying out here. One is the media narrative. And there's even been some people that I actually respect a lot as journalists who've sort of gone with the angle, and in a very limited way, I get it. Compared to so many other people that Trump is nominating, Ben Carson, Rick Perry, Betsy DeVos, Michael Flynn, appointing, not to mention Steve Bannon, Rex Tillerson and ExxonMobil actually have a certain reputation. He's certainly incredibly smart, and he runs a ruthless, globally effective corporation. Now, these are not things that I think recommend somebody for that job, but they, I guess, speak to competence and in that sort of technocratic obsession that some people have. This speaks to that. Then there's also people falling for Exxon's greenwashing, which is incredible. I mean, David Dane was on last week, and we know that Exxon has played at the very least a double game on climate and has probably been, in fact, deceiving its investors about climate change as a threat to its business model for potentially decades. But the real bottom line is, and it goes back to the assessment from last week, that Rex Tillerson and ExxonMobil see the world as a giant carbon map to be exploited and extracted. And, I guess that makes sense if you're running a global oil company and you're not even sort of feigning an interest in the transition from oil to energy. You're saying, as long as there are deposits of hydrocarbons in the earth, we're going to suck them up, burn them, and profit enormously from them. And there's a politics that is connected with oil. Jeremy Rifkin calls it an elite energy source. It is something that involves incredible sort of technological capacity. It involves very intricate deal making, and it involves very complex delivery systems. And in his role as head of Exxon, and Exxon as a company have always meant that whether you're talking about Chad or Indonesia or Equatorial Guinea, human rights, environmental considerations always take a firm backseat to energy exploration. It's an oil company. That's what they do. All too often, U.S. foreign policy has been in the service of energy interests, but we are going to see this taken to another level under Rex Tillerson, and there's no reason to think that it would be otherwise. And I'm going to quote now a little bit from Rahm. He talks about Exxon and climate. He talks about Exxon, in terms of their role in spreading public misinformation, the media accepting greenwashing around Tillerson. But he does get into the Russia angle. And this is where the Russia stuff really matters, okay? Yes, Russia hacking into computer systems. It's a legitimate story. It's worth talking about. I think some people have completely went overboard with it. They've used it as an evasion for explaining a failed campaign. And of course, there's, I don't really care about hypocrisy per se as an issue, frankly. But yes, of course, the United States interferes in other people's elections. But this is actually important, is the synchronization of interest between Exxon as a company, Tillerson's career, and Russia's climate and oil geostrategy. I'm going to quote now from Rahm. Tillerson personally negotiated with Putin a monster $500 billion deal for Arctic drilling that was expected to change the historical trajectory of Russia before sanctions killed the deal. His rise as Russia's czar, which was his, I believe, his title within Exxon, coincided with Putin's own rise as leader of Russia. Tillerson is so wedded to Putin that The Guardian just reported that he's the one-time U.S. director of a Russian oil firm based in the tax haven of the Bahamas. So this drilling in the Arctic is very important because in the short term, the trends from global warming will actually make more of those oil deposits available for drilling, exploration, and investment. Of course, his only experience is as a global oil man, and all other issues, human rights, science, everything are just ancillary to that pursuit. And if this deal is on the table and can be re-engaged and renegotiated through getting rid of sanctions and partnering up with Russia again, and there's no real clear sense of how Tillerson is going to be disentangled from Exxon in terms of his own personal financial interests, how is this not going to happen? I mean, this is so obvious that even Saturday Night Live this past weekend, it was brilliant because the sketch was that Putin shows up and he's working Trump and saying you're brilliant and you're amazing, and that soothes Trump. But then Tillerson shows up, and him and Putin go over a map together of all the places they want to drill and blow Trump off. I guess so he could go tweet at China. And this was also signaled when Russia did not back the Paris Accord, which Rahm also notes. Because again, in a short-term geostrategic sense, some of these climate trends might benefit Russia. Now, I'm just going to quote the last couple of lines. As I've written, imagine how much havoc Putin, Trump, and Tillerson could wreak future negotiations. This is in terms of climate, by coercing other countries to avoid new pledges to ratchet their emissions, which is the cornerstone of Paris' strategy to avoid catastrophic climate change. Lee Raymond, Tillerson's predecessor at Exxon, once explained, I'm not a U.S. company, and I don't make decisions on what's good for the U.S. The fact that continued global warming and melting of polar ice cap will make it far easier to drill in the brutal offshore conditions of the Russian Arctic is no doubt just another coincidence, as is the fact that Russia subscribed some observers by not yet ratifying the Paris deal. So that's the part, in my view, of the Russia story that really matters. And I'll get into some of the more sort of interesting and disturbing details of Russian foreign policy and the strategic thinking behind supporting far-right groups in Europe, why they might have preferred Trump. These are valid conversations. But the irony is for people, some people on, I would say the dumb left who don't want to explore that. Again, there's what Sam Criss brilliantly called the alt center. There's people who are just off in Russia derangement syndrome and everything is Russia's fault and we don't have to talk about anything because Russia, okay? That's ridiculous. And then there's another extreme, which is that Russia is almost like this misunderstood place that's constantly victimized by America, when the reality is like it's a global mafia petrostate. And the opportunity they see with the United States is not, and the Trump administration is not to be a secret fighter against imperialism like some people on the left kind of want to delusionally convince themselves, and nor is it just to sort of do some sinister, dastardly Russian KGB plot. It seems pretty simple. It seems like if we can find an administration and people in the U.S. who will stop putting sanctions on us, who can stop sort of getting into conflicts about our expansionist foreign policy, we can do some business together. And their business is extraction, oil, and petrochemicals. That's what their economy is built on. That's how they have booms. That's how the system works.
Hey, it's Sam Seder. Why don't you subscribe to this channel? You can do so right over here. Over. Subscribe.